Hello everybody, this is Dr. Kevin Connors. We're going to do a video that's a little technical, but I think it's going to be helpful for a lot of people on neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation, we're talking about neurological inflammation, and when we talk about that, we're talking about brain inflammation. So a lot of patients have brain fog, maybe due to, if they're doing chemotherapy, they certainly have brain fog, and we're going to explain some of the mechanisms of that. But certainly if they've had other issues like concussions or Lyme disease or heavy metal toxicity and things that can cause brain fog from neuroinflammation. So follow me through this. It might get a little technical, but we'll try to do the best we can through this. Okay, so neuroinflammation, much of this information is coming from the study of traumatic brain injury and all this information that's coming about with concussive disorders and post-concussive syndromes from football players, anybody that has had multiple little minor concussions or any major concussions is going to have brain inflammation and the effects of brain inflammation. Vascular injuries, like I said, toxins, heavy metal toxins are a big one for this, but certainly pesticides, herbicides, chemicals, anything that has the ability to get across the blood-brain barrier is going to cause inflammation in the brain, or anything that can affect the liver and or the gut can affect the brain via the vagus nerve directly. So it doesn't even have to be a damage in the blood-brain barrier. It can be a damage, it could still be a toxin that increases inflammatory cytokines, inflammatory markers, inflammatory chemicals in the brain, even if there isn't a direct cross into the brain. Biotoxins like Lyme disease, different spirochetes, viral infections in the brain, etc., um, can cause inflammation in the brain. Autoimmunity, if you have antibodies to neural tissue, can cause inflammation in the brain for sure. Even normal aging. And there's studies on emotional traumas, PTSD in itself. Stress can cause inflammation in the brain and damage to these cells that we're going to talk about. So first, a little bit of boring anatomy, but I think it's beneficial to help understand your symptoms. So in gross anatomy of the brain, you have different lobes of the brain. So in this picture, this is the front, if you can see my cursor on there, of the head here. This would be the back of the person's head. This is the brain. And this is the different cortexes of the brain. So they do different things. The prefrontal cortex is your executive function of the brain. It's where you plan and organize data and think through things. So when we have inability to do that, where I got a brain fog, I can't think, I can't understand things very well, that could be inflammation in the prefrontal area. The frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex sends messages back to the frontal lobe and then further back to other brain centers. So the frontal lobe is also part of that planning area, but it also has to do with motor function. So it tells your arm to raise and your leg to raise, and function of movement and motor function has to do with the frontal lobe, and that communicates back to the back of the brain called the cerebellum, which then smooths out that motor function. And then you have the parietal lobe, which is mainly a sensory input. So information coming back from your extremities, from the other body parts, are going to your parietal lobe, and that's telling you have pain or heat or cold or something else. So a person with chronic pain could the chronic pain, okay, I have a chronic knee pain. Could it be from inflammation in my knee due to arthritis? Sure. But could I have pain that travels around? Sometimes it's in my left knee, and then it's in my right ankle, and then it's in my elbow. What in the world is that? Do I have a problem with my left knee and my right ankle and my elbow? Well, possibly. But could I have a problem of inflammation in my parietal lobe? So I'm actually sensing the problem in the extremity, but it's the inflammation is actually in the parietal lobes. The inflammation is actually in the brain. And so the gross anatomy of the brain, but what we really want to talk about today in detail is the cellular anatomy of the brain. So you have two different types of cells in the brain, and those are the neurons. So the neurons are what you might be familiar with. They have the ability to reconnect and make new connections. That's called neuroplasticity. The neurons send signals over a distance. So my neurons in my prefrontal cortex are firing back to my frontal cortex, to my motor cortex, back to my cerebellum, and even all the way down my spine to fire to certain muscles. And they have interconnections, and those interconnections are called synapses, and the synapses have chemicals that communicate across that synapse called neurotransmitters. This is the cellular anatomy of the brain. And we'll talk a little bit about neurons, but what we really want to talk about with neuroinflammation are the other cells of the brain. Not so much the neurons, but these other cells called glial cells. Glial cells come from the Latin word for glue because when they were first discovered through anatomical dissection of the brain, it was just thought they just kind of held the neurons together. Well, the last 30, 40 years, we're finding that they do a whole lot more than that. Matter of fact, they could maybe even be more important than the neurons. We don't want to say that because they're all important and they are equally important. But the main glial cells of the brain are these ones right here, the oligodendrocytes. And the oligodendrocytes are what make up the myelin sheath of the brain. So if anybody has multiple sclerosis or some demyelinating disease, it is something that is deteriorating oligodendrocytes in the brain. And then there's astrocytes and microglial cells. The astrocytes are very important cells as well. They actually form the blood-brain barrier. Maybe you've heard of that. So your blood vessels that go through the brain is a enclosed space, so we don't want certain chemicals to get through there. And the way God made us is that we have these astrocytes that wrap around those blood vessels and actually form the blood-brain barrier. So we talk about the blood-brain barrier, a damaged blood-brain barrier. You are literally saying a damaged astrocyte. So astrocytes wrap around the blood vessels and they form the blood-brain barrier, and they limit what can pass through into the brain, into the neural tissue. So astrocytes form the blood-brain barrier. Astrocytes do other things too. Astrocytes actually clean out synapses. So we talked about the neurons themselves connect to one another, and there's a space in between that connection, and they communicate to one another through that space through chemicals called neurotransmitters through that space. And what cleans out and clears out those neurotransmitters and gets ready for the next connection, for that next call, you could say, are the astrocytes. So when we have too much or too compacted or miscommunication and issues with neurotransmission through neurons, it can be an issue with astrocytes. So astrocytes form a lot of different roles that we're discovering. One of the cells that we really want to spend our time on in this talk is this third type of glial cell called the microglial cells. Your microglia are specific cells in the glial cells in the brain that travel around. Astrocytes don't really do that. Oligodendrocytes definitely don't do that. But microglial cells would be equivalent to a macrophage immune cell in your body. So if you've ever seen pictures of macrophages that travel around, maybe in biology class, and seen a video of a macrophage that travels around, finds an enemy, a pathogen, and engulfs it through a process called phagocytosis. So it literally surrounds it and gobbles up that bacteria or that virus. That's how macrophages kill things in your body. That's how microglial cells function. So you can see they have these little tentacles that help them kind of swim around in your brain, and they help clean your brain and kill pathogens, living organisms, and they grab onto oxidative organisms or oxidative chemicals that could damage your brain and get rid of it. So they are really your lymphatic system combined with your immune system of the brain. So they help keep the brain clean. They are the scavengers. They're what keeping your brain clean. So that's what we want to concentrate on, these microglial cells. The problem is microglial cells, if they're functioning correctly, are doing a great job of keeping your brain clean. But what if they get damaged? So microglial cells normally have these nice tentacles. They look like a little octopus that's traveling around. You've seen pictures of videos of octopuses swimming around in the ocean. That's kind of what microglial cells are like. Maybe not quite so fast as an octopus, but they're swimming around in your brain and they're devouring bad guys. Um, if I have a condition where I injure my brain. So I have some exogenous source like a concussion, like I got smacked in the head, I had a horrible fall, a car accident, or multiple minor concussive instances like I'm playing football and smacking my head every day, 40 times in practice and then on game day. And this has been going on for decades or at least years. You got all these multiple incidences of injury that cause inflammation in the brain and can damage neurons for sure, but if they start to damage microglial cells, we're in trouble. So microglial cells normally are in this what's called a resting state, but they're actually very active. So it's kind of a misnomer. So they're active, healthy state. But in the terminology and a lot of things they'll call resting state microglial. Resting state microglial is a term that we use for healthy active microglial. Yeah, sorry about that. So sometimes when things are discovered, it was discovered under a slide and you couldn't see the motion, so they look like they're healthy resting state, but they're actually active and they're moving around the brain, devouring things. The problems when they get activated, meaning there's an injury. So this shows an injury through different chemicals, through lipopolysaccharides, which can be from a bacterial infection. They can become primed. So in the primed state, they're either labeled as primed M1 or primed M2. Now, I know this is really technical, but follow me here. This is really, really important if you have any of these kind of symptoms. So if you're dealing with any brain issues, brain fog, chemical sensitivity, you just can't figure out why you can't get better, possibly diagnosed with Lyme disease, diagnosed with chemo brain, uh, or you have early onset dementia, you're starting to follow the pathway of your mom or dad who had dementia, you don't want to follow that pathway. You need to catch this next couple points. So the more primed microglial cells that we have, the worse off we're going to be. So microglial cells, let's take a step back. Microglial cells in their resting state or their healthy state are devouring bad guys and they're cleaning up tau tangles, which are what are believed to be what are called causing Alzheimer's disease. They're gobbling up pathogens. They're cleaning up things that will cause oxidative damage and possibly cancer in our brain. That's what resting, or we could say healthy microglial cells are doing in the presence of any history of damage. We gave some examples of concussion and Lyme disease and bacterial infections and even high amounts of stress. My microglial cells can get damaged. What damaged microglial cells are what are called primed. Primed. Primed microglial cells. So a primed microglial cell is not going to act like a healthy microglial cell. They start to lose some of these tentacles, you could say. Here's a little bit better picture of a prime microglial. So here's a healthy microglial on the left-hand side of the picture, a patrolling microglial, where this slide says that's a better name for it. And then a prime microglial, it starts to lose these tentacles. So both the M1 and the M2 microglial cells are in the primed state. They still have a function in the brain, but they're no longer roaming around, patrolling, looking for enemies, clearing enemies. They're just sitting there. They lose their ability to move. And then the problem is that they can be in these two different states. The M1 state is a pro-inflammatory state, meaning that it's spewing out inflammatory chemicals. That's not good. So a prime microglial cell is actually a bad guy in your brain. when it's in the M1 state. When it's in the M2 state, it still has a positive function in your brain. It's an anti-inflammatory function. It's giving off what are called Th2 cytokines, which are specific anti-inflammatory chemicals that can actually help decrease inflammation in the brain. Now, it's not roaming around and decreasing inflammation, but at least it's decreasing inflammation right where it's sitting in the brain. Now, understand, you have millions of these microglial cells in your brain. When you get a concussion, they don't all get primed, or you would probably be dead. But you could have a number of microglials primed. And the more you have, this is a sliding scale. And the more damage that you do to your brain, whether it be a continued viral infection or continued traumas or whatever it be, the more you don't move out of the state that is causing prime microglial cells. You can't have prime glial cells from being a boxer, and then you continue your boxing profession causing more prime glial cells and think you're going to get better. Is what I'm saying. So, the damage that happens to these microglial cells is permanent. So once a microglial cell loses its tentacles and becomes primed, it's never going to not be primed. So catch that. Once a microglial cell becomes primed, it's always primed. You can't go back, which is a little bit different than the neurons. So the neurons, if they lose connection, let's say a neuron dies that it's connecting with, that neuron can change and move and form a new connection with another neuron. That's called neuroplasticity. Well, neuroplasticity is defining how neurons, that other brain cell, can reconnect and grow and learn new things. So when you're learning new tasks, like you're listening to this information, and this is all novel information to you, your neurons are making new connections. That's called neuroplasticity. It's called learning. Microglial cells don't do that. So if your microglial cells are damaged, they're primed, if you go, boy, oh my gosh, I got some of these symptoms. Oh yeah, I got some primed microglial cells. Yeah, you do. So what we want to do, our new life purpose for those with primed microglial cells is to keep them in the M2 state. So if you could push your damaged microglial cells, the prime microglial cells that you do have from past incidences and whatever got you to this state right now, use of chemotherapy, use of drugs, whatever got you to the state of brain fog and issues and brain inflammation that you currently have, that damage is going to be there. Can you improve your state? Well, yes, you can, by pushing the primed microglial cells in the M1 state to the M2 state. You will improve your condition immensely. So you're going to hugely decrease the inflammation in your brain. However, you are always going to have to be working at pushing M1 to M2. You're always going to have to work at keeping primed glial cells in the M2 state. So damaged microglial cells are in the M1 or M2 state. It's your job to keep them in the M2 state. The more you allow them to be in the M1 state, the more they're going to spew out inflammatory cytokines, the more they can actually prime other microglial cells, the more you're going to go down this rabbit hole that there's no end. This is what dementia is. So all the studies in post-concussive disorder that's showing damage to microglial cells is pointing a whole lot of arrows to what Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and brain degenerative issues are really caused by. So this is your new life purpose. You can get a lot better. So if you're confined to home and can't work anymore because you got such brain fog and you just crash and you can't get out of bed for weeks at a time, sometimes you get prime glial cells. So that's neuroinflammation. If you're forgetting things and you can't remember why you walked in the kitchen anymore, and you have to just take a step back and remember, the why you came in this room or what you were looking for, that's not necessarily prime glial cells. That might be very mild neuroinflammation, but still you could take these pieces that you would use to push to decrease inflammation in the brain or to push M1 microglial cells to M2 microglial cells and still get the same results. So very, very important to follow these steps. And this is how kind of we take a patient through this process. I'm just going to give you an overview here now. So how do we push prime microglial cells from the M1 state to the M2 state? Well, we go through what a couple phase process. Number one, you got to look at lifestyle. So exercise is important, but it's got to be very mild exercise. Over-exercise can actually increase inflammation of the brain. So do not be pushing exercise. Next, alcohol. People with prime glial cells cannot be consuming alcohol. There's just too many studies that show it increases inflammation of the brain. And lots of times you'll see people with prime microglial cells. That's how you could know you have prime microglial cells, is when you have to sleep 12 hours after having a few drinks. You are affected greatly by alcohol. Pollution and toxins. Many of these people overreact to pollution and toxins and fragrances that other people don't react to. That's another sign. These are also signs that you have prime microglial cells. So keeping these out of our environment, making sure that you're sleeping. Really very important, the sleep issues and working on getting your sleep. People with prime microglial cells also have more issues with EMF, electromagnetic frequencies from our environment, from cell phones, from cell towers, and working on stress reduction. So those are some initial lifestyle changes. Dietary changes. You cannot have gluten. You cannot have dairy. Gluten and dairy fire right back to the brain, pro-inflammatory cytokines. Remember, any inflammation in the body for any reason could travel neurologically up the vagal nerve, could travel through the blood. Inflammatory cytokines can stimulate increased cytokine production of the brain and will increase inflammation of the brain. So consider going gluten-free, dairy-free, cutting it way down at least. Consider going paleo. Look at histamine issues, because histamine can be a trigger for this. We tend to run some blood tests called a Cyrex 10 panel, which could give us some inflammatory markers in the gut that will fire inflammation in the brain. So we look at that too. Consider a keto diet or time-restricted eating. That's what TRE is, time-restricted eating. Going on some intermittent fasting. That's another terminology for it. That can be really helpful. But this is part of our protocol that we go through with a patient. And then the specific nutraceuticals. You have to be really careful with nutrients. You do not want to take too many things. Usually people that we have in the Lyme community or post-concussive community that seek care in our office, many times we'll only have them on one or two things. So this is a product that in the supplement fact thing here, it's a product called AI, stands for autoimmune. It's a product that I formulated. So this is our labeled product. It has a binder, that's pteramine, that's the clay that's in there. It has green tea extract, has curcumin, has another resveratrol, it has grapeseed extract, has N-acetylcysteine. N-acetylcysteine is to help increase glutathione production. The rest of them are all Th2 stimulators. So think of, in your immune system, you have your Th1 and your Th2 system. Your Th1 system is your pro-inflammatory system. Your Th2 system is your anti-inflammatory system. It's really the same thing as your M1 microglia and your M2 microglia. So we want to stimulate M2 microglial function, which is going to push M1 microglial to the M2 state. Remember? So that's what we want to use, anti-inflammatories that will help do that. There's a bunch of other products that we go through with patients, but we usually less is more with patients that have this issue. So you got to go really slow and see what they can tolerate. And then we use the Rife to help with decrease inflammation. The Rife is a frequency generator. We do that a lot with our patients that have primed microglial cells, especially if they have primed microglial cells due to an infection like a spirochete, Lyme infection, or any other type of chronic virus that can cause brain encephalitis or brain inflammation of any kind. So that's typically our phase one. And then we move into phase two with blood-brain barrier support, supporting astrocytes, supporting the infection, working on killing the infection if there's a biotoxin present, working on detoxing toxins, heavy metal toxicity, which literally I could have an hour-long talk on heavy metal toxicity, and microglial priming. And especially with what's in the vaccinations, the worst type of heavy metal is in the vaccinations because they're nanoized particles. So nanoized particles of aluminum are teeny little particles of aluminum that you think, oh, well, it's such small pieces of aluminum, it will do less damage. But actually, the smaller the particle of heavy metal, it does more damage because it is easily crosses the blood-brain barrier and it becomes a toxin in the brain that just constantly is spewing out inflammatory cytokines and in itself causes primed microglial cells. The worst thing that you could have are these nanoized heavy metals. Really, really dangerous. So I'm very much against the vaccines that are coming out that are in all the vaccines now. So be very careful of that. Hypoxia in itself can be a cause for this, and we have to work on increasing oxygen levels of the brain. Hormone issues, you have to look at balances of those. Autoimmune issues, certainly if you have antibodies to neural tissues, you just have ramped up increased cytokines, oxidative stress from other toxins as well. So we want to look at all of these, but this gives you a little bit of an overview of primed microglial cells as a cause, as really the cause of neurological inflammation that just is perpetuating. So you could have one instance of trauma, a horrible concussion from a car accident, and then literally you don't start getting these symptoms of this neurological inflammation for 10, 15 years later. And now you're getting brain fog and early dementia in your 50s or 60s, and like, what in the world is wrong with me? Do I have Alzheimer's? Well, yes, maybe, but it's really from microglial priming. So that terminology, I want you to kind of get embedded in your brain. Microglial priming, and have your new purpose be, I need to keep pushing my M1 state primed microglial cells to the M2 state. Oh, this is a lot to digest. All new terminology. That's why we need that neuroplasticity in your brain and your neurons being able to reconnect and form these new pathways so you can understand this, because it is essential to you to keep your brain. If you don't have your brain, you don't have anything, right? So working on pushing and keeping prime microglial cells in the M2 state is what is going to be the solution to this, and it can stop and it could put the brakes on this degenerative process that's going on that could lead you to full Alzheimer's disease and damage that is irreversible. So the faster you can jump on this bandwagon and work on this, the better. Hopefully this will give you some information. I put this slide on at the last because this is our website. Go to our blog. We'll constantly have more and more information on this. And I should have put our other website on here. It's about our chronic Lyme website, but there's a link to our chronic Lyme website site on this site, and it talks more about damage from vaccine injuries and not just Lyme disease, but we have it on a different site. So go to our site, follow us on our blog, look at our videos, and we'll have more on this subject. Thanks. Bye-bye.